When I was in the UK earlier in 2025, I spent some time riding aboard the Southeastern trains between London Charing Cross and Tunbridge Wells, plus the branch line from Grove Park to Bromley North. Since 2021, we've had one Southeastern route in TrainSim World, and although it doesn't feature any parts of the network that I've been to in real life, with the sole exception of St Pancras Station, where Haribo's granddad just fell over and died, I still wanted to re-examine this route and see how well it holds up 4 years after its original release. The original version of Southeastern High Speed for TSW was released in February 2021, and it was essentially a remake of the old London to Faversham High Speed route in TS Classic, only including the 51 miles of track from London St Pancras to Faversham. Later, in September 2022, and as part of the TrainSim World 3 package, we got an extended version of SEHS, now including High Speed 1 down to Ashford and the North Kent line up to Dartford. Total route length is now a more reasonable 89 miles, but as for the price, the version of this add-on that's compatible with TSW5 costs a staggering 57 New Zealand dollars at full price. I wonder how Dovetail could justify such a high price, considering the fact that the standard edition of the base game is $71, and that gets you 3 routes. As for motive power, the base route includes 3 distinctly different electric multiple units from Southeastern's fleet, with the EMUs in question being the Class 375/9 Electrostar of 2003, Class 395 Javelin of 2009, and a Class 465/9 Networker of 1991. When I was staying in Tunbridge Wells near the end of my trip, I rode aboard the 375s and 465s to and from London. However, I didn't get the chance to ride aboard a Class 395, and have only seen one of those units in real life. This was at St Pancras on the evening of Tuesday the 15th of April. The extended version of SEHS also includes the Class 66 diesel locomotive, which, at this point, should be awarded the title of Most Overused Locomotive in TSW History. At this point, the same old EWS or DB cargo variants, mainly the latter, have been recycled and resold in so many add-ons that it's not funny, and I think it's high time we got more locomotives for UK freight trains in TSW, such as the Class 68, Class 70, Class 73, and Class 90. On the plus side, Spratty Heath has made a mod pack featuring lots of additional variants for the Class 66, not just liveries, but also changes to the headlight clusters where appropriate. While I still want to see more UK freight engines than just the 66 in TSW, having this mod installed is at least better than seeing the same old EWS and DB cargo liveries over and over again. Besides the units and locomotive included with the base route, you can also get the Class 700 Desiro City as a separately sold add-on to run on SEHS, as part of a Thameslink service that starts or terminates at Luton, although route coverage limitations mean that you can only drive this unit between Dartford and Rainham. The 700 was released for TSW in July 2023, and costs 25 New Zealand dollars at full price. Unfortunately, only one variant of the Class 700, namely the 8-car 700/0, is included with the TSW add-on as standard. This means that, by default, SEHS is the only route on which you can take the 700 for a proper run. The layer on Peterborough to Doncaster is only for AI services or playable, albeit very short, ECS moves. The 12-car 700/1 is an important part of the Brighton Main Line's rail scene, but the only way to get this unit to appear on the route in-game is to install a timetable mod. If a modder can sort out the 12-car variant and an accompanying timetable, I don't see why Dovetail couldn't have done the same thing themselves. On the whole, I think the Class 700 is a decent add-on, especially when compared to the original TS Classic version. The TSW version has much better modelling, and the default sounds were tolerable, although the DC motor sounds were not recorded from an actual 700. For those who play this game on a PC, I recommend installing the sound mod made by Itzia165, link in the description. I like driving the Class 700 from time to time, but it's disappointing that, aside from Peterborough Station, we don't really have any part of the Thameslink network north of Farringdon in the game, so we can't really make use of the unit's dual voltage capability. On a personal note, I've only ridden aboard a real 700 once, specifically Unit 700-038 for a short trip from St Pancras Thameslink to West Hampstead Thameslink. I thought the onboard environment was pleasant enough, and it was quite surreal to hear Matt Streeton, who I recognise from his appearances in Jeff Marshall's videos, voicing the announcements, but I'm not a fan of the ironing board seats. The Class 395 is arguably the star of the show on Southeastern High Speed, with perhaps the most notable aspect of the London to Faversham run being the voltage change required at Ebbsfleet International. Currently, and until the NEC New York to Stamford route and North London Line Richmond extension are released, SCHS is the only TSW route that offers an opportunity to switch power modes on a dual voltage EMU. The Javelins were built by Hitachi Rail of Japan, and first entered service in 2009. 29 examples of this class were built, and they're all made up of 6 coaches with a curious lack of first-class seating. In TSW, the Class 395 is supplied in the prototypical Southeastern dark blue livery, with the nearest thing to any additional liveries being the rainbow decals that automatically appear if the unit loads in as 395012. Considering how often developers seem to like making gameplay packs, never mind the controversial nature of those packs I guess, I'm surprised they haven't done one for Units 395015 in her Railway 200 livery. In any case, I kind of prefer the Hitachi IETs over the Class 395, although the older unit is still interesting in her own right. Thinking back to the Class 375, this unit mainly appears on regional services going to or coming from London Victoria, and on the TSW route, most of her services are only playable between Faversham and Rochester. As I alluded to earlier, when listing off the trains included with the base route, Dovetail made the bizarre decision to only include one variant of the Class 375, namely the 375/9, which has a 3x2 seating layout, and I've had enough experience riding aboard British trains with this layout, such as the Class 350/2, to know that it's quite awkward and uncomfortable, especially with such a narrow centre aisle. There are actually 5 variants of the Class 375 in real life, and although I'd rather see the older 375/3, 375/6, and 375/7 variants added to TSW, it would still be better than nothing if DTG only added the 375/8. It wouldn't surprise me if that's the only additional variant we ever get, since she wouldn't require as many alterations from the existing 375/9 model as what would be required for the 375/3, /6, and /7. As for the Class 465 networker, this thing is used on local services along the Dartford to Gravesend section of SEHS Extended, but she also has a few services between Rochester and Faversham as well. For the longest time, I've considered Dovetail's recreation of the Class 465/9 to be one of the better EMUs in Train Sim World, with her high level of detail and decent default sounds. Although this unit, like the 700, has a sound mod made by Itzy165 and available on the TrainSim community website. However, one thing that still confuses me is the lack of the other 3 Class 465 variants. That's the 465/0, 465/1, and 465/2. Just like the situation with the 375, it's very unrealistic to only see one variant in game every single time a 465 shows up. In real life, there were only ever 34 examples of the 465/9 variant, compared to 50 465/0s and 47 465/1s. Incidentally, there were numerous occasions where I saw a /9 running in tandem with a /0 or /1. Given their numerous visual and mechanical differences from the Metcam 465s, I wouldn't be surprised if DTG never bothers to add the BREL/ABB units in TSW, but I don't see why they couldn't at least add the 465/2, since that subclass was the basis for the 465/9. I've just realised that DTG could now do 465/908 in her Network Southeast Heritage livery, but preferably as a free update instead of yet another overpriced gameplay pack. Since the release of SEHS Extended, Dovetail have churned out 2 gameplay packs for the route. The first one was a Railhead Treatment Train pack, released in October 2022, and the second was a Europhoenix Class 37 pack, released in March 2023. Both variants cost $9 each at full price, and the former also includes a heavily weathered variant of the EWS Class 66, while the latter also includes a Southeastern White reskin for the Class 375/9. This would have been a good opportunity to include the missing 375 variants, and it's as if Dovetail took one look at the idea and said, stuff that, it's much easier to pretend that the other variants don't exist. For the longest time, I held off from getting the Railhead Treatment Train pack, especially since I had already got the heavily weathered Class 66 with the ECML Peterborough to Doncaster route. However, I did eventually pick up the RHTT pack, and it only cost me $4.49 in a sale, with the sole reason why I bought it being that it's a requirement for the GBRF Class 66 reskins that come with the enhancement pack for WCML London to Milton Keynes. Timetable mode features 203 playable services for the Class 395, 117 services for the Class 375, 229 services for the Class 465, 83 for the Class 700, 10 for the Europhoenix Class 37, and, if you've got the RHTT pack, a total of 74 services for the Class 66. The regular passenger and freight services will always appear regardless of what month you select when you set up to spawn in on foot, while the Class 37 on Electrostar drags will only appear if you set the month to January or February, and the heavily weathered Class 66 with the RHTT will only appear in October and November. Whenever I feel like driving a short service with an electric train in TSW, one of my go-to options is the Rochester to Faversham, or vice versa, run with a Class 375 or Class 465. Another service I like to operate is Dartford to Rainham, or vice versa, with the Class 700, and somewhat ironically, I don't drive the Class 395 all that often. It's also worth mentioning that, if you own Skyhook Games' Midland Mainline add-on, the Class 43 HSTs will appear on AI-only / off-map services in and out of St Pancras. Incidentally, none of the passenger trains on this route are compatible with TSW5's guard mode. In saying that, I would be wary of possible bugs if guard mode was ever added to these trains. Indeed, I generally don't use that feature at all, because, if what I've learnt from watching Train Sim Society is anything to go by, guard mode is still riddled with bugs. Go figure. Of course, SEHS is not a perfect add-on. For one thing, there is no representation of the Eurostar Class 374, or even the Class 373 for that matter, so the HS1 section between St Pancras and Ashford doesn't look or feel quite right in-game. A smaller issue can be found on the Class 465, where the keyboard command for the tail lights doesn't work, for whatever reason. As for the scenery, I don't usually look at it too closely because I'm focused on driving the trains, but even then, I think it's not as good as what you see on Train Sim Germany's Niddertalbahn and Mittenwaldbahn, but not as bad as Rivet Games' West Cornwall Local and Arosa line. As for the performance of SEHS, it's okay on my end, in the sense that the route typically runs at between 60 and 110 frames per second. One time, I noticed that something had gone wrong with the dispatcher at Ashford International. For whatever reason, the 8:16 AM departure to St Pancras just sat at the platform doing nothing, and was still there at 8:58, thus causing a backlog of trains that were stuck behind it and not moving. Meanwhile, there were two southbound empty stock moves that had come up right behind the passenger service I had just driven down from London, and they sat waiting at signals close behind my train until the AI driver took over and sent her off the map to Margate. I don't understand how that 8:16 train could still be stuck at the platform after all that time, but I do know that this is not the only instance of dispatcher problems I've seen in TSW. New York to Trenton flashbacks intensify. Also, what the hell is a Southern Class 377 doing in Ashford? On the topic of ridiculous bugs, I had an incident where I selected a service with the Class 395 starting from Ashford at 1914, but the game spawned me on the platform at Newington instead of in the 395's cab at Ashford. Okay, sure, I could, and eventually did, use fast travel to get over to my train, but that doesn't excuse Dovetail from not fixing such a major bug as spawning the player at a different station from where they expected it to be. And what's worse was that the AI had seemingly taken over the train before I had the chance to sit down in the cab, and the game didn't give me an on-screen pop-up with the option to give up control of the service. Make of that what you will, dear viewers. To add, I also noticed this Class 66 on an AI-driven service with both the head and tail lights on, as well as some issues with the NPCs, although that sort of thing is not isolated to SEHS, sad to say. Firstly, they were getting stuck in bunches by the doors at Stratford International, and this was not a one-off. Secondly, this one had somehow glitched through the platform at Ashford International, and thirdly, these two were stuck and fumbling about on Platform 4 at Dartford. To be clear, I'm not bringing up all these bugs just to embarrass DTG. I'm simply keeping a record of observations that I made while exploring the route. Besides the lack of additional variants for the Class 375 and Class 465, not to mention the aforementioned bugs, another thing about this add-on that still confuses me is the lack of the branch line from Sittingbourne to Sheerness-on-Sea. While the branch is not as amusingly short as the one from Grove Park to Bromley North, it's still an interesting line in its own right, and I don't see why DTG should have omitted it from SEHS. In lieu of more appropriate units, they just used the 465/9 to represent the Sheerness service, and this had me wondering, if they're going to acknowledge the existence of the Sheerness branch, why not go the whole hog and actually add the full branch along with a 3-car Class 375/3, or better yet, the Class 466, since these little 2-car networkers were still in use on the Sheerness branch as recently as 2019, when they were replaced by 375s. At the end of the day, I have mixed thoughts on the extended Southeastern High Speed route for Train Sim World. It is let down by the lack of the Sheerness branch, the aforementioned NPC bugs, poor scenery in some places, possible gridlock caused by the faulty dispatcher, and the possibility of the game spawning you in the wrong location when you select a certain service. Considering how expensive the DLC is these days, none of those aforementioned bugs should still be present. On the other hand, this is a unique, non-linear route that combines high-speed and classic third rail lines with two completely different signalling systems and a busy/varied rail scene, provided you've got all the right DLC for the layers. If I could suggest any ways to improve this route, besides the bug fixes that should have happened already, they would be to upgrade the scenery to a standard similar to the Mittenwaldbahn, modify the lift assets at various stations throughout the route so that the lifts actually work, extend the route coverage to Sheerness-on-Sea and add the missing variants of the Class 375 and Class 465. As it stands in its current state, I think Southeastern High Speed only deserves a 6.8 out of 10, and to anyone who's stuck around to the end, you win a German-made car that's full of almonds, cashews, and pistachios. It's a Mercedes nuts,